Welcome to Play the Man Podcast, a podcast seeking to build sturdy men in a wobbly world.
Welcome back to the Play the Man Podcast. Today we are sitting with Pastor Peter Johnson and Pastor Shane Pennington. We're covering a topic that we covered a couple of men's meetings back on Christian nationalism. And it's a timely topic because it comes up occasionally here on the news. But I think we're just going to talk a little bit about what it means, what it could mean, and what we should do with it as a concept. So let's start with some definitional parts to this. So what do you guys think this is supposed to mean and what it could mean, maybe? I don't know.
This is a little tongue-in-cheek, but are we discussing Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism? Because that's what the media calls it.
Yeah, so, I guess you're right. So I think we should do both. And I'm not sure where to start because this whole thing is highly definitional. And
it's like debating a Mormon. You use the same terms, but each term means something different to each person.
That's a good way.
Right? So what makes this such a difficult topic is that almost any person you engage on this topic has different definitions of what it is. And that makes it, our terms are not properly defined.
Yeah.
And so, Doug Wilson once said, if what you mean by Christian nationalism, do I love Jesus Christ and my country? Yes. Is that Christian nationalism? No. If you happen to be white and say that, is that white Christian nationalism?
Right.
No. If you hear a definition on MSNBC of what Christian nationalism is, it's something different than what Doug Wilson would say. What are our terms?
Yeah. And I think that's why I kind of said that opening up, is because it is all over the map, all the way from Trump worship to white boogeyman, Christian nationalism, MSNBC. These are the bad guys that are going to try to take the country by force or whatever, and everything in between. And then you throw in some of the New Apostolic Reformation stuff with, that have been kind of using the term, and then you've got Reform guys using the term, and we're not talking about the same thing, and we're not even in the same plane as far as what we believe theologically. It's broad, and so it's one of those things where it's like the guys who are articulating it well, I feel like, yes, I'm on board, but I don't always know what the person across from me means when they say Christian nationalism.
Yeah. What is the shade? Like what is the negative perception? So the term gets thrown out. You're watching CNN. What visuals are they putting with this?
It is parades with sort of Harley Davidson Christian white men with beards and ARs on their front chest with a sling.
Yeah.
And banners with Trump or, Jesus wearing a MAGA hat.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be one illustration.
Yeah.
Of, where you can, they can say a picture, is worth 1,000 words. Yeah. 500 truths and 500 lies, right? I mean, it depends.
Yeah.
Is that Christian nationalism? Well, I don't know.
I've never done a church event with an AR. I just haven't. I mean, I've done a couple of men's trips where we brought handguns, and it's not something we suited up for.
And this is what I mean by it's so hard to define, because if you're in a certain company and you say, I'm a white evangelical Christian and I voted for Trump, for some people, that's white nationalism.
Yeah.
That's white Christian nationalism. The very fact that you voted for Trump and you're an evangelical and you're white makes you a white Christian nationalist. And
I think there's that CNN, MSNBC caricature J6, but we're gonna take the Capitol and the White House, and we're gonna set up our own Christian prince or pope or whatever. But I think there's another layer of people who are interacting, and maybe they're more sane, who are they're just afraid of, aren't we going to lose religious liberty? Aren't we democratic? If we bring Christian principles into our government, if we ever had a Christian nation, what does that mean for Muslims? What does that mean for Jews? Isn't it just going to become heavy-handed? Isn't it just going to become the Spanish Inquisition? Isn't it just going to become the Crusades or whatever all over again? And I think there's some who kind of have that's the fear. I mean, I don't know if you've met this kind of person before, but there's a huge swath of evangelicalism who believes, the church was humming along, it had no problems. Corinth was awesome. Everything was going well. And then this emperor came along, Constantine, and he was converted to Christianity. And he made Christianity.
He nationalized it.
He nationalized it. He made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, which is actually not what he did. He legalized it.
He was sort of white.
Yeah. And then the church went to hell in a handbasket, and it didn't recover till the Reformation, right? I mean, that's kind of how we think about things. And so I think there's that. If people know nothing about church history, they know the conversion of Constantine, and it was bad. And anytime the church ever gets in bed with anything that looks like political power, it's done. It's over.
To your point, right, the next example right after that people use is the Crusades.
Yeah.
You just had, centuries worth of crusades. Like 4 crusades for political ambition primarily.
Yeah.
And it was grotesque by the end of that, right? It was a system of getting money. Like, it became its own industry.
Right. But maybe this is a good time to talk about that. But I think, and this is a sense where Americans don't really know history, but Americans don't really have proportion either, and you take the worst examples of Christian rule or reign or whatever throughout history. I mean, you take the Crusades, which is probably the worst, 200 years and maybe 2 million dead. And probably a lot of those were Christians, right? I mean, just famine, war, all of those kinds of things that went into it. But we're talking about...
They're at least white nationalists.
Yeah, at least the bad guys that died, right? But then, or you take the Spanish Inquisition, 200 years again.
Yeah.
200,000?
Yeah.
Maybe? I mean, those maybe are high numbers. You take even something that's like in our collective consciousness all the time, something like lynching in America, which is bad, right? But 4,000 people died maybe over a 75-year period. 30% of them were white, So you take like these worst examples, Salem witch trials, anything you can conjure up in church history. 4,000 people dying over a 7-year period or 75-year period. I mean, that's Thursday at Planned Parenthood. Thursday. I mean, that's one day, 4,000, and most of those are Black and Hispanic. And so, it's just that sense of proportion of, yes, Christians who have been in power have done bad things in the past, but when you look at it as compared to what have atheists who are in power done, Pol Pot, 2 million over a couple of years.
Lenin and Marx.
Yeah, Mao, 60 million.
Yeah.
I mean,
you have 2 options. You can be ruled by Christian nationalists, or you can be ruled by a global secularist.
Yeah.
Well, let's start tabbing up global secularists.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you go to Hitler, you go to Stalin, Pol Pot.
Yeah.
And you're talking, you're quickly in the tens of millions, if not higher, of just tyrannical. Then you look at issues like what? With all the mistakes of Christian leaders, politically, even theologically, making mistakes. But guess who expunged slavery? Christianity. Right. I mean, people are going to debate that, but I think if you look at the facts, it's in England it was Wilberforce, right? Where does religious liberty come from?
Right.
It really comes from Christian rule.
At least we're acting against our own standards and principles when we don't live them out.
Well,
but it's our code of conduct. It's our standard that establishes.
We're not going to kill you. And so these laws that, now no matter what religion, we're Hindu or we're Islamist or Muslim or whatever, but now we got to live as a Christian. I mean, show me where that's happened. It has happened. I know that.
Right.
But I mean, look at the Great Melting Pot. I mean, even during the colony, you had rabbi chaplains in the Continental Army.
Yeah.
Unheard of before. Absolutely unheard of. I think you bring up a good point. In defining this, I think a prerequisite is, you have to understand your history. And by saying that, I'm not saying I do. Right?
Yeah.
I got plenty of homework ahead of me, but I've heard many arguments that were not grounded in good history.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There was no historical context of what has been and where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that it is the Christian worldview, it is the scriptures that establish religious liberty. It establishes things like tolerance. And so atheists can talk a good game on those issues, but eventually there is no standard, so there's nothing to appeal to anymore. And so it starts off as John Lennon's Imagine, and there's just there's no religion, there's no hell below us and above us only sky. But then eventually there's gulags,
right? So it's the mystique of neutrality. There is no sort of secular neutral area where I'm not an atheist and I'm not religious.
Right.
No, that neutrality is a phantom. It doesn't exist. And
don't you think people are seeing that now? I mean, it's interesting to me that we've even had someone like Richard Dawkins who says I want a cultural Christianity.
And Elon Musk is now saying the same thing.
I don't want to make any demands on my life, but I realize we're coming out of a Christian tradition. I want to hold on to pieces of it. It almost feels to me like somebody who's I don't want any weird stuff. I don't want any I don't want gay parades. I don't want transgenderism. I don't want pedophiles. I don't want any of that. But can't we just have Sports Illustrated swimsuit issues and maybe Victoria's Secret magazine?
Christmas hymns.
I don't necessarily want to obey God's law, but I want it up to a point.
Yeah.
Right.
But then I don't want it to go to its illogical conclusions. I don't want the sin to run its full course. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right.
And so I feel like we have folks like that in America that are I don't want to obey God, but I also don't want what happens when we just let sin run its course.
That's a great observation, because I think so many people, humanists specifically, have to believe in all forms of their philosophies that people are inherently born good, and that's just simply not true.
Right.
And I think that a religion, and specifically Christianity, is inherently it's built to restrain evil. God is asking his people to restrain other evil, their own evil. There's personal accountability to sin, right? There's this, we need to fight temptation, right? These are self-governing principles that create a better citizen at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I completely agree, and I think that it's a fabric that's kind of coming undone.
Right.
It's not being torn asunder. It's being unmade almost. And without it, you will lose what we had at the beginning, which was kind of a natural rule of law, God's law that governed it. You said that earlier in a different podcast. And now we're just going to straight contract law, which is not based on anything but what we can agree to. It's just pandemonium.
Yeah.
And I think at the highest corporate levels all the way down, it fractures the society eventually.
Well, if you want to study history, just look at the difference between the American Revolution versus the French Revolution.
That's the right one.
So right before the French Revolution, you have this sense of the Enlightenment. The Renaissance moves into the Enlightenment, and there were a lot of good things that came out of the Enlightenment. We have to agree with that. But
great poets.
There was also this sense of a modern Babylon.
Yeah.
We can create a very humanistic sense, right?
There's no limit.
There's no limit, and there is no God, and we are the masters of our own fate, and we can create what we want, and it will be awesome.
Yeah.
And there are books, dystopian books written all about that, novels and such,
Right.
But yeah, it.
And I think even like France to a certain degree still has to like kind of lean on its Christian history to kind of keep together. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think they kind of know that because, I mean, where there's a vacuum, you know, something else is going to fill it. And secularism is a vacuum. It's not going to hold it together. And so it takes something like Islam coming along for people to realize, like, oh, we've got to have something that's more cohesive, more binding, more, you know. And so that might just be some kind of national identity that comes back together or whatever. But you see them grasping for nationalism of some sort. They don't know what the cohesive binding thing is going to be in that nationalism. It looks like after we watch the Olympics, it's going to be more of the reason and the French Revolution and those kinds of things. But just judging off the opening ceremonies.
What is a culture, right?
Right.
People always say, you know, well, politics is downstream of culture.
Right.
Well, what's upstream of culture? It's theology.
Yeah.
Because a culture is defined, that glue that you were just talking about, are a society's cultic practices.
Yeah.
You know? And you can be the cultic practices of the Aztec, you know, where you're sacrificing humans and eating them, you know, or you can be in the imperfections of the Western culture, which are largely influenced heavily by Christianity. Doesn't mean it was governed perfectly. You know, there are a lot of mistakes, a lot of you know, atrocities we could talk about. But what was the ultimate outcome?
Yeah. And don't you think that's probably the best of what Christian nationalism is, I mean, the guys I hear that I gravitate to are basically saying, we were a Christian nation. Not in the sense that everybody was regenerate or anything like that, but we were a Christian nation in the sense that we were founded on Christian principles. It was the glue that held us together. It was our national identity. In God we trust. And we need to recover that if we're going to stay together. Like, that's, you have to have a glue, you have to have a standard, you have to have a foundation, and it's going to be something. And I want it to be Christian, and that's the only one that tends to end well.
Right.
Yeah, I also think from a definitional perspective, and might be why it makes sense to say liberals to report things this way, is because everything feels like it needs to be overly labeled, and everyone needs to be a part of something.
Yeah.
And like, we don't look at our religion like it's a label. Like, we look at it like it's a practice, that there's rights, there's participation, there's duty, there's all these things to it, but it's not simply a label. But like, if you think about all this gender things we have right now, with everyone is changing the gender or getting a new pronoun or whatever, it's just like, it's an identity problem. It's this higher law we're talking about giving us a Christian identity originally. What's lacking here is, without that, the voids are getting filled in the most random and wild things and ways people can come up with.
Right.
And it's super strange. I saw this movie, and I guess I'm kind of recommending it. It's a German movie, and it's called The Wave. And it's about a high school that's having 1 week of kind of an experimental class, and it's just about politics. And the teacher doesn't know where it's going to go, but at the beginning, he starts talking about German history, and the kid's like, "This, enough of that. Like, the Nazi thing will never happen again. We learned our lesson." And he goes, "Oh, okay." And then the rest of the movie is essentially testing that theory. And what he does is he says, "Hey, class, you guys are a club. You know, who do you want to lead your club?" Right? And he basically starts having them form up a self-governance thing. But what immediately happens is they have a handshake. And then it's kind of a salute. And then they have some nomenclature. And then that group was protecting people within that group. They weren't friends before, but now they're in a group and they're friends and they're protecting each other. And like, they're gaining identity. And for some of these kids, it's funny and fun, but for some of them, it's important. And that's what mattered at the end of the story, was it became important in a week to this kid or a couple kids to be a part of something. And I always thought that's like such a deep human problem.
Yeah.
We want to feel connected. And I feel like we want to feel connected to our country. Right? And we want our country to feel connected to us. Like, we want this inherent respect and stuff. But without sort of this fabric or a shared fabric, everyone's finding the answer to this void in different ways. And it's grotesque. we're looking at it, looking over our shoulders, going, "Is this really happening?"
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's the beauty of the book Lord of the Flies, right?
Oh yeah.
Where these young boys get stuck on an island, and pretty soon these groups do form, right?
Dear Piggy.
Yeah, and the poor old piggy loses his life, right? But when it devolves to this like chaos and anarchy, and the way the book ends, where the young boy is crawling through the sand of the beach, and then he comes to these shiny shoes, and he slowly starts looking up from the shoes, and it's a starched British Navy officer in his dress, and it's like the symbol of order, civility, culture, civilization, all these things. But it goes deeper from a Christian perspective. It's the holiness of God, and it's what ought to be transmitted from a Christian community to a fallen and broken world. That part of being image bearers is what we do, is we project the image of Christ to a broken world. And in many ways, just metaphorically, we are that British naval officer. And the boys look up, it's an adult, it's a man. All these things of this dichotomy of one culture to the other, and that's, I think that's our role as Christians in the community. That doesn't mean that your Christian nephew who now becomes Muslim must be disowned or worse, right? I have seen that in Iraq so many times. It doesn't mean that. That's the liberty of, well, what does it mean? You're going to pray for that person. You're going to witness to that person. You're going to continually project the truth of Christ to that person. But that person has the liberty to convert to another religion, right? That is religious liberty in a Christian environment.
And secularism, atheism is not going to give you inalienable rights.
No.
Where are those going to come from, right? They come from the state. The state giveth, the state taketh away, or the mob, or whoever, And so, if you don't have that foundation, so that's always an interesting argument to me, that Christians are afraid that a Christian nation is going to take away the very things that the Christian nation gave us, the tolerance, religious liberty, these kinds of things. And
I feel like I feel the hilarious part of it is like, we tested this out already, guys.
Right.
But 100 years ago.
But there's still people that no, but it wasn't a Christian nation,
Yeah, and you're like, no, but it was close. I mean, it's fallow ground. I don't really know if you can have a true theocracy. I'm not sure. I don't know if God designed it that way, really. I just don't know. But we did give a run at it. And it kind of can work if it stays super localized. And I don't want to get crazy here, but I actually think there's a world where America regionalizes differently. I'm not saying that would be better, and we would lose a lot of global standings, and I don't know how it would work with the army, but California is its own country. It should be its own country. It shouldn't be burdened or being burdened by the rest of America. There's things we could do to allow political things to shape up differently a little bit.
You think, so maybe we're getting way off topic now. I kind of think, if you know anything about football, you've heard of maybe conference realignment.
Yes.
I kind of feel like, that could happen in America. That's probably the best case scenario.
Yeah, okay.
That there's just kind of a conference realignment, so to speak. Conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten kind of started absorbing teams, and you kind of had these super conferences come about, things like that. But everybody kind of got sucked into one or two conferences, and you kind of had super conferences. I kind of feel like there might be states that kind of start making alliances and kind of become realignment with super conferences and things like that.
I literally regionalized purposely. Right, we came out to Oklahoma because of that. Because I'm lining up regionally.
Well, and I think you brought up a good point when we talk about what is Christian nationalism. And I think those that don't know what Christian nationalism is, or what a theocracy is, really, truly, versus what the church is, they would say Christian nationalism is synonymous with theocracy, and it isn't.
Right.
We are I mean, we're members of a kingdom, right? We're unapologetic about that. Mm-hmm. But we're members of a kingdom that is in the world that is broken and sinful. And we are mandated to be in this world and to be a witness for Christ in this world. But, that's distinct from a theocratic viewpoint.
So, and this world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, as the scriptures say. And, so,
and it's the now and the not yet.
Right.
Ultimately, the kingdom in its fullness is a theocracy. Christ is the king forever, right?
Yeah.
But that's not where we are in the not yet.
Yeah.
So, in a practical way, what's the important part of this conversation in conversation with another person? Like, if it is to come up in topic, is this a thing we want to kind of wrestle down to take the terms back to let the other person know, like, I go to a real church and this is what we actually think, like, because most people, I think, we're talking about it with a shared context. Most people that come to us with this term likely don't have the shared context of the church. And so it almost feels like, for me, it's almost too layered. Unless we're having a lengthy conversation, there's a lot to like tease out, to redefine, and to contextualize within what I think the church actually looks like. If I don't have like this built with this other person, it could be a tricky conversation. But I do think it is completely ridiculous, based on the visual you kind of painted earlier. This is not jihad. Like, there's real jihad, and it really looks violent, and it's actually happening today. And it's not what they're trying to like. Christians don't do that on publicly. There's no jihad for Christians per se.
And ironically, secularists are okay with Muslims.
So good.
Who are doing jihad? You know what I mean? So like the white Christian nationalists are scary. But the actual jihadists are.
I'd rather be scary than cutting people's heads off. Like, it's crazy to me to compare.
I always think that's.
Right? It's nuts. It's crazier to you to compare, actually, Pastor. But
I remember seeing a real picture from Pakistan, an old man holding a sign in English, and it said, "Behead those that say Islam is a violent religion." I mean, it's
real.
Told you it's peaceful.
So the question kind of is like, I don't like that they're saying this is some all-out war situation where Christians are like arming up, although I think we would if we had to. I'm saying this isn't that situation by a long shot. Right. So what part of the conversation should you take back?
This is a conversation that I think is most appropriate on social media. That's where we're going to get our biggest gains. Facebook, perfect.
Both points on comments, it'll work.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm derailing your question. What was the question?
No, it's so in the conversation of Christian nationalism, you have someone who a little bit. What do you tease out to help set them right on? Like, if there's something to be set right on, what should you have them walk away with?
I would encourage people to, one, this is another topic that's going to require study. It just is. You have to know your own terms, and you have to understand what you're talking about enough, I think, to ask really good questions. And I think a good conversation, a good starting point, is just be able to ask good questions. If you start to say, I'm going to win you over on my view of what Christian nationalism is, it's going to be that Facebook chaos, right? Right. But you got to be able to ask great questions like, well, I think Christian nationalism is terrible. Well, what makes you say that? Do you have any examples? What is your definition of Christian nationalism? When you ask questions, you're not playing the belligerent fool. And hopefully you're causing people to think. Now, in the midst of that conversation, those questions are hard to be mindful of, right? Oh, what was that question? You've got to be able to do some homework on these things.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Doug Wilson. I think he lays it out well, where it's like, are you going to be a globalist? Are you going to be a nationalist? Or are you going to be a tribalist? And what's your option? Those are pretty much your three options you're looking at there. I think most people historically, if you look at it, nationalism's the best option, and then you're going to, okay, well, what flavor of nationalism are we going to take? Is it going to be secular nationalism? Is it going to be Christian nationalism? Is it going to be Islamic nationalism? I mean, what's it going to look like?
But we're entering an arena where even nationalism, don't put Christian for it, just nationalism. That's now synonymous with fascism, you know.
Yeah.
And so when you say Christian nationalism, what you're saying is white Christian fascism. I mean, that's where...
That sounds terrible.
That's how that sounds terrible, I admit it. But that's how it's skewed this whole conversation is. So, I mean, if you say, you know, so you could have a conversation that maybe your nation is like your home.
Yeah.
You know, why do you have a fence? Mm-hmm. Why is your dog that kind of dog? You know, why do you have cameras on? You know, what do you do to protect your home? What do you do to protect your nation? You know, what are the rules of your home? What are the rules of your nation? You know,
and I think something maybe with other Christians I would want to kind of push on is that viewpoint that is so prevalent that the church is only faithful when she's a persecuted minority.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, and because it's almost like the church is schizophrenic in some way, or, you know, it's like we want to win the world for Jesus.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like every soul?
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to win the world for Jesus. And you're like, so like, what happens when Constantine gets converted?
Yeah.
You know, if you win Constantine, then then we might have Christian nationalism. And then what would happen then? You know, then the church goes to hell in a handbasket. Like, so it's so it's almost like, people aren't thinking it through, or it's like we want to win the world for Jesus. We just want to win souls, and we want those souls to be almost disembodied and have no relation whatsoever to what's going on planet Earth.
Right.
You know, and it's just, so I would just encourage Christians to maybe think more about what do they think the end game is, and what do they think Jesus came to do, and what did he come to save, and maybe thinking through that so that it's not so dualistic and really incongruent with what the mission even is. So.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think of my tours in Iraq, and as a chaplain, I had to study, you know, Islam, and I study a lot the difference between Sunni and Shia specifically, but I'm studying the Shia, and it's like there's a lot of similarities between being a Shiite Muslim and a Christian. Mm-hmm. This almost defeatist attitude, this almost the perpetual persecuted minority. Yeah. But our hope, the 12th Mahdi is going to come, you know, and the 12th Mahdi comes when everything's chaotic, you know, and we're going to rest in that. But in the meantime, we're going to be beaten, we're going to be trodden, we're going to be stomped on, and our only hope is in the future.
Yeah.
Where, no, guess what? We are more than conquerors, right?
Yeah.
And we're not just, you tally up the disembodied souls. Well, we got another believer, you know, just be quiet and live in your house and don't rock the boat, you know, where
we're going to win the world for Jesus, but we lose.
You know, it's like no, but can you have a healthy biblical conquest of your neighborhood, right? You know, where you're sharing the gospel, you're interacting, your house is open, you're involved in your church, and you're uncompromisingly faithful to Christ, even when it hurts, you know, and people see it and say, you know, I want to be a part of that. You know, it's not earthly gain. It's eternal work for the kingdom, and it is being that salt and light where we're at, and we got to be discerning, because I think there's a similarity between legalism and licentiousness. You know, right? We don't want to err on either side, and there's an error we can make by saying being a patriotic Republican Trump voting individual is synonymous with evangelical Christianity. No, it's not. Right. You know, no, it's not. You know, we can err on that side, but what's going to make the world think we're that way is the moment you're pro-life, the moment you believe homosexuality to be a sin, the moment the world is going to lump you in that direction, and there's nothing you can do about that.
In some sense, you can't control the labels.
You can't control that.
So embrace it, define it, and I think that's maybe the
don't embrace that label placed on you, but embrace your faith. Right. You know, and know that people are going to label you and push you there, and then try to dismiss you as a crazy MAGA that's what that's what our country is going to do with us in our polarity right now. But I would say be unafraid of it.
Yeah. Lean into the awkward conversation.
Yeah. Well,
awkward is awesome.
Yeah.
So we had a visitor when we addressed this topic for our men's event, and the visitor said, in my church, we can't even talk about this.
Oh,
and I thought, what a shame.
Yeah.
That even talking about it in church is to be it.
Yeah.
The worst definition of a Christian nationalist. And I thought, if you can't talk about it, that's just a shame.
Awesome. That wraps up for today.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Play the Man podcast. Stay sturdy, friends.